The autumn fog rolled heavy through the narrow lanes of Bloomsbury, muffling the gas lamps and swallowing sound until even the clip of horse hooves seemed to vanish into the damp night. Inside Gresham House, a converted Georgian townhouse now serving as a private club for scholars and eccentric thinkers, the atmosphere was anything but silent. A maid, pale as candle wax, had just burst from the third-floor study, her shrill cry cutting through the building, "Mr. Latimer is dead!" The door was locked from the inside. Within minutes, members of the club and servants crowded the corridor outside the study, whispering in disbelief. Horace Latimer, antiquarian, mathematician, and a man whose arrogance had earned him equal parts admiration and hatred, was not merely dead. He had been found sprawled across his desk with a look of frozen horror, his pen dropped mid-sentence, and an inkwell overturned like spilled blood beside his hand. But the true impossibility lay in the circumstances. The door to the study had been secured with its heavy brass key, still lodged in the inside lock. The windows, inspected immediately, were bolted, the panes unbroken. No one could have entered or escaped, and yet Latimer's lifeless form lay before them. It was not long before Inspector Andrew Fenton arrived, summoned from Scotland Yard with all the urgency the club's governors could muster. A broad-shouldered man with a soldier's bearing and a policeman's cautious eye, Fenton greeted the sight grimly. He pushed through the crowd and ordered the room cleared, allowing only his constable to stand by. The detective took in the study with deliberate slowness, cataloguing every detail. The room smelled faintly of musty vellum and scorched tobacco. Books towered precariously in shelves. Maps were pinned across the walls, and Latimer's desk bore the clutter of manuscripts, strange mathematical diagrams, and a solitary brass compass lying oddly out of place near his limp hand. Fenton bent over the body. Latimer's face was contorted as though he had seen something dreadful, though no wound was visible. His skin bore no trace of bruising or blood, yet his lips had turned an unnatural shade of bluish-gray. Poison, perhaps. But the detective knew too well that poisoning within a sealed room was a trick seldom executed without leaving some trail. No glass, no vial, no trace of unusual liquid appeared on the desk. The man had simply died, yet not naturally. That much was certain. The first unusual clue presented itself when Fenton examined the paper upon which Latimer had been writing. The unfinished sentence read, "It is not the numbers, but the spaces between them that reveal." The pen stroke trailed off into a blot, as though death had seized him mid-thought. At first glance, it seemed the fevered rambling of a man too absorbed in esoteric puzzles. But to Fenton's experienced mind, such fragments were seldom without weight. Was Latimer leaving behind a clue, or had death interrupted him at the very threshold of some cryptic discovery? Turning from the desk, Fenton inspected the window frames, tested the bolts, examined the hearth. A small fire smoldered low. Ashes scattered about as though papers had been hastily burned. He sifted through the remnants with a poker, but found nothing legible, only fragments of parchment charred beyond recognition. The maid, questioned at once, swore she had heard nothing unusual save for a thud minutes before she entered. She insisted no one had passed her on the stairwell leading to the study. Another servant confirmed that the corridor had been empty, the locked door unbroken. As Fenton worked, the members of the club waited anxiously in the smoking room below, whispering theories. Some declared it was suicide, others murmured darkly of curses. For Latimer had been obsessed with translating a medieval cipher, said to have driven its last reader into madness. The more practical among them muttered about financial quarrels or rivalries over manuscripts. Yet all agreed upon one fact. None could explain how a man could perish in a locked chamber with no assailant near. Fenton, meanwhile, uncovered a detail too small for the others to notice. On the rug beneath Latimer's chair, almost hidden in the weave, was a tiny scrap of metal, thin, curved, and broken. He picked it up with his handkerchief and studied it. A fragment of wire, perhaps. Its presence in such a room was peculiar. Latimer had no machinery, no instruments requiring it. Fenton pocketed it, saying nothing. As the hour pressed on, the detective reconstructed events leading up to the discovery. Latimer had dined in the club that evening, withdrawn to his study shortly after 9, and instructed the maid to bring him tea at 10. When she arrived, the door was locked. She knocked, received no answer, and after repeated attempts, summoned the steward. Together, they forced the door open by unscrewing the outer hinges. That was when they found him, slumped over, the key still protruding inside. The timeline left but a narrow window for anything sinister to have occurred. Standing in the dim study, Fenton gazed again at the compass. Why had Latimer kept it at his desk? It was a navigator's tool, incongruous among dusty tomes and algebraic scrawls. He lifted it and found a faint smudge upon its lid. Fingerprints, perhaps, though blurred. A second glance at the desk revealed scratch marks near the keyhole, as though metal had been inserted there recently. Yet the lock bore no sign of forced entry. Combined with the wire fragment, the thought gnawed at him. Had someone devised a trick to secure the door from outside, leaving the illusion of a sealed room? When he rejoined the club members downstairs, he studied their faces one by one. The steward, nervous, sweating. The maid trembling, still pale. And among the scholars, a range of reactions: fear, fascination, even poorly disguised satisfaction. Latimer had made enemies, that was sure. The problem was not motive but means. Someone in this very house might hold the secret behind the locked room. As Fenton prepared to send word for further examination of the body, he glanced once more at the scrap of paper with Latimer's last words. It is not the numbers but the spaces between them that reveal. An unfinished message, perhaps meant to be his greatest scholarly discovery. Or perhaps a desperate attempt to signal his murderer's method. Whatever its meaning, the words hovered over the mystery like a shadow. For the moment, the locked study remained a puzzle unsolved, an impossible crime, where every clue seemed less an answer than another layer of deception. And yet, Fenton felt, the truth lingered somewhere in those ashes, that compass, and the silence between numbers. Inspector Fenton's reputation was solid enough among his peers at Scotland Yard, but he knew the limitations of police procedure when it came to puzzles such as this. Routine questioning, cataloguing of evidence, and forensic examination would carry the case only so far. The locked room demanded an eye accustomed to subtler games. Thus, when he sent a discreet wire before midnight, it was with the knowledge that someone far more adept in such enigmas would soon arrive. By the following morning, the fog had not lifted, and the gloom within Gresham House seemed thicker still. Horace Latimer's body had been removed to the mortuary, though his study remained sealed. The club members sat in strained silence over their breakfast, their usual arguments about philosophy and politics hushed into uneasy murmurs. Each seemed to watch the others, as though the murderer, if indeed there was one, might give himself away through a misplaced glance or careless word. It was into this air of suspicion that Lord Peter Wimsey entered, his tall frame and languid elegance belying the sharpness of his gaze. He removed his gloves with casual precision, offered a light quip about the weather to no one in particular, and then followed Inspector Fenton upstairs, as if the house belonged to him. Behind his monocle and whimsical manner lay an alertness that pried into corners others overlooked. The study awaited him, precisely as it had been left. Fenton outlined the facts: the locked door, the bolted windows, the burnt papers, the cryptic sentence, the compass, and the fragment of wire. Whimsy listened without interruption, wandering the room with the air of a man at a gallery, his fingers trailing lightly over surfaces. At last, he bent to the desk, lifting the sheet of paper with Latimer's unfinished line. "Numbers and spaces," he murmured. "How tiresome of a mathematician to die in the middle of a puzzle." But what was he trying to reveal, and to whom? His gaze flicked toward the compass, and he smiled faintly. Curious bedfellow for a pen and ink. One does not navigate oceans from Bloomsbury, unless, of course, the seas are metaphorical. Fenton cleared his throat. "We found that beside him, though there's no explanation for it." "None obvious." "At least," Whimsy replied, replacing the compass. He then knelt near the hearth, prodding the ashes with a delicacy that mocked the constable's earlier rough handling. Among the fragments, he extracted a sliver of parchment with edges half burnt, a faint line of ink surviving. "East by." He slipped it into his pocket without comment. As he rose, his eyes caught something Fenton had overlooked. On the inside sill of the window lay a fine streak of reddish-brown powder, almost invisible against the grain of the wood. Whimsy touched it with a gloved fingertip, rubbed it lightly, and brought it to his nose. "Iron filings," he said. "Odd place for them. Do you suppose Mr. Latimer had taken up blacksmithing?" Fenton frowned. Nothing of the sort in his rooms. He was a scholar through and through. "Precisely," Whimsy answered, satisfied. He moved then to the door, running his hand along the lock and hinges. "A neat little trick here, Andrew. If one had the right tool, say, a slender wire, one might turn the key from outside, then withdraw and leave the victim to appear quite alone. Not easy, but possible. Your fragment of wire, I think, will prove rather more than rubbish on the carpet." The inspector's expression darkened. "Then it was murder, indubitably," Whimsy said lightly. "The question becomes, who had reason and who had skill?" Downstairs, the questioning began again, this time under Whimsy's amused but penetrating eye. The maid repeated her story, but when asked if she had ever cleaned Latimer's desk, she hesitated, glancing nervously at the steward. Whimsy caught the look, storing it away. The steward himself, a burly fellow named Prentice, insisted he had heard nothing until summoned. Yet his hands twitched when asked about Latimer's recent quarrels. The club members were brought in one by one. Dr. Algernon Crisp, a historian with a tendency to sneer, declared that Latimer's death was the inevitable conclusion of a mind dabbling in cursed manuscripts. Professor Grantley, gentler and bespectacled, admitted that Latimer had been working on a cipher text from the 15th century, an obsession that had consumed his every hour. Mrs. Ashe, the only female member, spoke with disdain of Latimer's arrogance, though she denied any animosity. Whimsy asked few questions, preferring instead to watch. He noticed that Crisp's voice grew louder when the compass was mentioned, though he claimed no knowledge of it. Grantley, by contrast, grew pale when asked about the burnt papers. Mrs. Ashe alone met his gaze steadily, her composure unbroken. It was not until tea was brought in that Whimsy made his next discovery. The silver tray bore cups arranged neatly, but one teaspoon bore a faint discoloration, a bluish residue at the edge. He lifted it casually, as though admiring the silverwork, then slipped it back without a word. Poison perhaps, but why only the spoon? He marked it in his mind, another piece of the puzzle. By late afternoon, the fog had thickened once more, the house seeming to close in around them. Fenton pressed Whimsy for his thoughts, but the detective merely smiled. "My dear fellow, the pieces are on the board, but the game has only just begun. We have a locked room, a dead scholar, a mysterious compass, a burnt secret, and guests who lie with varying degrees of talent. One does not rush the endgame without first enjoying the play." Still, his eyes betrayed a sharper concern. The iron filings, the burnt parchment, the poisoned spoon, they were not random. They formed the outline of a design, one yet obscured. And, as Wimsey watched the members of Gresham House move uneasily in their chairs, he saw the first flicker of truth. Someone here knew more than they admitted. Their deception had not gone unnoticed. The only question was how soon the mask would slip, and what danger might follow when it did. The fire in the smoking room crackled low, throwing long shadows across the carpet, as the suspects gathered once more under Inspector Fenton's authority. Lord Peter Wimsey lounged in an armchair near the window, monocle glinting faintly in the lamplight. His manner almost languid, but his attention keenly fixed on each word spoken. One by one, the voices of Gresham House unfolded their accounts, and with them, the subtle fractures that told of concealed motives and hidden truths. The steward Prentice was called first. His broad shoulders filled the doorway, his heavy step betraying reluctance. He recounted, for the third time, how the maid had summoned him when Latimer failed to answer. "The door was locked, sir. Tight as a drum," he repeated, dabbing at his brow with a handkerchief. "I fetched the tools myself, unscrewed the hinges, and found him as you know. There was no one about the passage. That I swear." Wimsey tilted his head. "A marvel of efficiency, Prentice. Tell me, what time was that exactly?" "Near 10, my lord. 10 sharp by the clock in the hall." "And yet," Wimsey said softly, "the maid recalls you were some minutes before answering her summons. A man of your strength. Surely you do not dither when called." Prentice flushed but muttered, "I was in the cellar, my lord, fetching a bottle for the governor's supper. Took me a minute to climb back." Wimsey smiled thinly, but said nothing further, letting the silence press. Fenton noted the steward's shifting gaze, and the way his hands clenched too tightly around the handkerchief. Next came the maid, little more than a girl, her hands trembling as she twisted her apron. She spoke in hurried tones, eager to prove her innocence. "I brought the tea tray just before 10, sir. Knocked and knocked, but he never answered. I thought he'd fallen asleep, so I waited a little, then fetched Mr. Prentice." "Did you notice anything unusual about the tray when you carried it?" Wimsey asked casually. She blinked. "No, sir. Only the spoon was not the same as usual. It was heavier like the ones kept in the locked cabinet. But I thought nothing of it. Mr. Latimer always wanted things his own way." Fenton's eyes darted toward Wimsey, who raised his brows ever so slightly, the faintest acknowledgement that the girl had offered more than she realized. Professor Grantley, summoned next, adjusted his spectacles with nervous fingers. His account was detailed, almost rehearsed, as though he had repeated it to himself many times already. "I was in my chamber from 8:30 until after 10, working on my translation notes. I heard the commotion when the door was forced, of course, but I did not stir until summoned." "Quite the industrious evening," Wimsey remarked. "You and Latimer worked often on similar manuscripts. Did you not?" Grantley hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, though his interpretations were eccentric. He pursued patterns where none existed. It was bound to come to nothing." "Yet you grew pale, Professor," Wimsey said lightly, "when we mentioned the burnt papers. Surely their loss does not grieve you, if they were but eccentricities." The man's lips pressed thin. "Scholarship may be eccentric, my lord." But the destruction of knowledge is always regrettable. His voice carried conviction, but his eyes betrayed unease. Whimsy noted the tremor that ran through his hand as he replaced his spectacles. Mrs. Ashe followed, her composure a striking contrast to the others. She carried herself with elegance, answering each question with calm certainty. Mr. Latimer was a brilliant man, but intolerable in manner. He believed all others beneath him, even those who attempted to assist. I had little patience for his arrogance, but no cause to wish him dead. Still, Whimsy said, studying her carefully, he did confide in you, did he not? He valued your counsel on matters of organization, if not intellect. She smiled faintly. He valued only himself, my lord. If he confided, it was because no one else would listen. Her poise never faltered, yet Whimsy detected a trace of disdain too polished, too carefully measured. A woman who concealed irritation beneath courtesy, and perhaps something more. Last came Dr. Crisp, his tone sharp, his manner defensive. I have told you already, Inspector. I was in the library from 9 until after 10. Alone, yes, but engaged in serious work. Latimer's death is no surprise. Men who tamper with cursed manuscripts suffer cursed fates. That has always been the way of it. Cursed manuscripts. Whimsy asked with polite curiosity. You mean the cipher he struggled with? Precisely. A code devised by monks who trafficked with forbidden knowledge. Latimer thought himself cleverer than they. Well, the dead are seldom clever. My lord. The bitterness in Crisp's voice lingered, even after he ceased speaking. Fenton pressed him with practical questions. But Whimsy observed his darting glance whenever the compass was mentioned. Crisp avoided looking at it altogether, as though its presence unsettled him. When the questioning concluded, Whimsy rose, stretching languidly. Most illuminating, he said, though his eyes gleamed with sharper meaning. We have a steward who answers slowly when speed is demanded, a maid who notices a spoon heavier than it ought to be, a professor who trembles over burnt pages, a lady too composed for grief, and a doctor who cannot meet the gaze of a compass. A charming little orchestra of dissonance, don't you think, Andrew? Fenton frowned. They can't all be lying. Oh, but they can, Whimsy replied cheerfully. The trick lies in the harmony of their lies. Each plays his part, hoping the discord will pass unnoticed. But we, my dear fellow, are listening for the tune beneath. As the suspects dispersed under watchful eyes, Whimsy returned to the desk in Latimer's study. The burnt parchment fragment still in his pocket. He placed the compass beside it, studying them together, as if they belonged to the same riddle. Somewhere among those contradictions, the truth was concealed. Each witness had offered a different version of events. Each had shaded their story with omissions or too careful details. But deception, Whimsy knew, was like an ink blot. It spread, staining all it touched, until the pattern revealed itself. And already, faint outlines of that pattern were beginning to emerge. The rain had begun by the time evening settled over Bloomsbury, a steady drizzle tapping against the windows of Gresham House. The club members had retreated to their chambers under watch, though the murmur of footsteps and the occasional creak of the old stairwell betrayed restless nerves. Inspector Fenton sat at the long oak table in the smoking room, notes spread before him in orderly columns. Across from him, Lord Peter Whimsy idled with his cigarette holder, though the absent-minded tapping of it against the tabletop revealed a mind far from idle. Each of them lies, Whimsy said finally, his tone light but precise. The difficulty is that their lies are not uniform in shape. One is thick with haste, another polished with too much care. They overlap, but not quite. Our task is to determine whether their motives overlap as well. Fenton rubbed at his temple. Every one of them could want Latimer gone. That man made enemies by breathing. Just so. But an enemy is not the same as a murderer. Let us untangle, shall we? Whimsy leaned forward, eyes gleaming with interest. Prentice first. The steward. He is paid to obey, but Latimer treated him more like a lackey than an equal. That delay of his, answering the maid, is suggestive. Was he taking time to ensure something was hidden, or merely covering nerves? His motive could be resentment, or coin. A servant always knows his master's secrets, and secrets can be sold. Fenton nodded, scribbling in the margin. And the maid. The maid, Whimsy murmured. Her eagerness to be helpful, to supply detail unasked, the heavy spoon, for instance. Innocent observation, perhaps. But why mention it unless she felt compelled to prove her honesty? Fear, Andrew. The kind of fear that makes people talk too much. She could be covering for someone. Or she might have been the unwitting carrier of poison herself. Fenton frowned. Poison delivered by spoon. Unusual, but possible, indeed. And now Professor Grantley. A scholar's jealousy is a more corrosive poison than any slipped into tea. Latimer was close, dangerously close, to unlocking that cipher. Grantley admits as much by his agitation over the burnt pages. He fears Latimer might have succeeded where he failed. Remove Latimer, and the race is won by default. Motive, academic rivalry? Tinged with desperation. The inspector turned a page. And Mrs. Ashe. She speaks too smoothly for my liking. Quite. Whimsy agreed. Her poise is armor. Latimer's disdain for her contributions, his refusal to treat her as an equal in scholarship, may have kindled more than irritation. There is pride there, pride sharpened by exclusion. But note this, she is the only one who displayed neither fear nor nervousness. That suggests either innocence, or the certainty of someone who believes herself untouchable. And crisp. Whimsy's monocle gleamed as he smiled faintly. Dr. Crisp, who invokes curses to mask his contempt. His bitterness was palpable. He dismissed Latimer's work as folly, yet his eyes quailed at the compass. Why, Andrew? What connection lies between that object and his unease? He would rather attribute death to supernatural punishment than confess the human motive of rivalry. Fear again, but a different kind, fear of exposure. Fenton leaned back, exhaling. So we have resentment, jealousy, pride, and fear. Every motive under the sun. And still no single thread that ties them together. Not yet, Whimsy said softly. He rose and crossed to the mantelpiece, his gaze sweeping the room as though arranging the suspects in an invisible diagram. Picture it as a maze, my dear fellow. Each passage a motive, each dead end a falsehood. But at the center lies the true design. Consider the poisoned spoon suggests planning. Someone who knew Latimer's habits precisely. The burnt papers suggest panic, someone desperate to conceal what Latimer had uncovered. The locked door suggests cunning, someone skilled enough to stage the impossible. He turned, his voice sharpening. It is unlikely all three devices were employed by the same hand. More probable is collusion, or at the very least, overlapping intentions. One may have sought to poison, another to disguise, another to silence. The trick is to see where these desires converge. Fenton's eyes narrowed. You think more than one was involved? Think? I rather suspect it, Whimsy replied. For why else would each account carry its own peculiar contradiction? It is as though they have rehearsed a play together. Yet each actor forgets a different line. He returned to the table, plucking up the fragment of burnt parchment. The faint words, "East by," still visible along the charred edge. He laid the compass beside it, its needle quivering faintly toward north. East by what? East by north, east by compass point, a direction perhaps. Latimer was writing of spaces between numbers, coordinates perhaps, or a hidden map. If so, then this cipher was no mere curiosity. It led somewhere. Somewhere worth killing for. The rain drummed harder against the windows as silence settled between them. At last, Fenton spoke. So they each had motive, resentment, rivalry, pride, or fear. But only one, or perhaps two, took the step into murder. Whimsy nodded, drawing on his cigarette. And the clue lies not in their motives alone, but in how those motives intersect. For greed sharpens resentment, fear conceals rivalry, and pride often masks desperation. The maze twists upon itself until one hardly knows which path is true. But I promise you this, Andrew, we are close to its center. Very close indeed. Somewhere above, a floorboard creaked, a hurried footstep retreating into silence. Whimsy's head turned sharply, his expression bright with sudden interest. "Our mice are stirring," he said softly. "When fear drives them to whisper in shadows, we shall be there to listen." For nothing reveals motive so clearly as the lies spoken in the dark. The footsteps above faded into silence, but Whimsy's sharp ears had caught enough. He rose without a word and slipped toward the stairwell, Fenton following close behind. The upper corridor was dim, the lamps burning low, and the heavy carpets muffled their tread. They moved past closed doors until they came to one left ajar, the library. Inside, a shadow stirred, and Dr. Crisp looked up from a desk, startled, as though caught in the act of something forbidden. "What brings you prowling at this hour, Doctor?" Whimsy asked pleasantly, stepping into the room. Crisp bristled. "I might ask the same of you. I could not sleep, and books are more comfort than anxious silence." His tone was defensive, yet his eyes flicked to the drawer he had hastily closed. Fenton moved forward, pulling it open before Crisp could protest. Inside lay a folded slip of paper, smudged with ash at the edges. Fenton spread it flat on the desk, and the three men bent over it. The writing was unmistakable. Horace Latimer's hand, neat but hurried. The cipher resolves to longitude, east by north. Beware the compass, it betrays. The sentence ended abruptly in a jagged line. Crisp threw up his hands. "I found it among the books. It must have been misplaced when they searched his study. I swear I had no part in it." But the inspector's face was grim. "This places you directly with evidence that should have been sealed away. Tampering with the victim's notes is damning enough." Crisp's indignation sharpened. "I was drawn to the cipher as any scholar would be. If I intended murder, why keep such a scrap? Why not burn it with the rest?" Whimsy leaned against the shelf, studying him with apparent amusement. "Why indeed? Yet one must admit, Andrew, the discovery is awkward. Our good doctor insists on curses. But here he is with a note that speaks not of curses, but of compasses. One might conclude he wished to distract us from the true nature of Latimer's work." Fenton seized on it. "Dr. Crisp, you'll accompany us to the yard. Until this can be explained, you are under suspicion of murder." The arrest was swift. The constable summoned from below led Crisp away, protesting with every step. By morning, news of the breakthrough had reached the club members, and the atmosphere lightened. Relief spread through the house, as though danger had passed. Even the maid smiled faintly at breakfast, whispering that justice would soon be done. But Whimsy's expression remained curiously detached. He sipped his tea, eyes unfocused, as though following a thread unseen by others. When Fenton approached with satisfaction in his step, Whimsy merely raised a brow. "A neat resolution," the inspector declared. Crisp had the note. Crisp feared the compass. Crisp mocked Latimer. Motive and means enough. "Perhaps," Whimsy said softly. "But permit me a small indulgence, Andrew. What if Crisp is guilty of foolishness, not murder?" Fenton frowned. You doubt it? The evidence is clear? Evidence is never clear. Whimsy murmured, rising to stroll toward the window. It is a fog, Andrew, and the trick lies in discerning what looms within and what is but mist. Consider. Latimer's message speaks of longitude, of betrayal by a compass. If Crisp were clever enough to kill for such knowledge, why leave the very clue that convicts him tucked so conveniently in a drawer? Murderers conceal, they do not misplace. Fenton hesitated, but pride stiffened his tone. Even so, we must act on what we have. The Crown Prosecutor will see it as sufficient. Or quite right, Whimsy said cheerfully. And yet, I cannot help thinking our game has another move to play. You see, Andrew, every labyrinth has its false exits. Doors that promise escape but lead only back into the maze. Crisp may be one such door. The day wore on with the club members loosening their vigilance. Mrs. Ashe conversed more freely. Grantley returned to his manuscripts with forced relief, and Prentice regained some of his bluster. The maid even hummed faintly while polishing the brass in the hall. To them, the danger seemed past. Yet Whimsy moved through the rooms with restless grace. Searching, listening. He examined again the study, the window sill with its iron filings, the compass on the desk. He lingered by the silver tray, tracing the edge of the discolored spoon with a fingertip. Each object whispered not of conclusion, but of unfinished business. That evening, as lamps were lit and the rain thickened, Whimsy joined Fenton once more. Our doctor sits in a cell, and yet I find myself sleepless. Tell me, Andrew, do you feel the house at ease? Or do you sense, as I do, that its walls conceal a watcher, waiting for us to declare the game finished, so that he might strike again? Fenton looked uneasy for the first time. You think we have the wrong man? I think, Whimsy replied, his smile edged with steel, that the right man believes himself safe. That, Andrew, is when he will grow bold. A false victory lulls not only the innocent but the guilty. Let us watch closely tonight. For if I am correct, the shadows in this house will stir again before dawn. The lamps flickered as the wind pressed against the windows, the rain rattling like impatient fingers on the glass. Whimsy stood by the hearth in Latimer's study, staring at the compass as though it might spring to life if only he watched long enough. Fenton had retired to the smoking room for a brief rest, but Whimsy's mind refused stillness. Something in the air of Gresham House lingered unresolved, like the echo of a word never spoken aloud. He drew the burnt parchment from his pocket once more. East by north, beware the compass. It betrays. He whispered the words, testing their weight. The phrase was not just warning but remembrance, as though Latimer had stumbled upon a peril that was old, not new. Whimsy frowned, recalling something half buried in his own library of curious knowledge. A cipher, a compass, betrayal. Where had he seen such elements before? At that moment the maid entered with her dusting rag, startled to find him still there. Whimsy smiled gently, reassuring her. But his eye caught on the way she avoided looking at the compass on the desk. You dislike that object, don't you? He asked. Her hands tightened around the rag. Only it was here before, sir. Not Mr. Latimer's. I've polished his desk many a time, and never saw it till 3 nights ago. It belonged to one of the gentlemen downstairs, I think. The words struck like a key turning in a lock. Not Latimer's. Brought in. Whimsy let her go without pressing further, his mind sharpening around this overlooked fact. The compass was no innocent relic. It had been introduced, planted. But why? When he rejoined Fenton, the inspector looked weary. Crisp will spend the night in a cell, and with luck the matter will be done. But you've that look again, Peter. The one that keeps me from sleeping. Whimsy seated himself, fingers steepled. "Do you recall the Fenwick cipher, Andrew? A case nearly 10 years ago, an antiquarian strangled in his own library, and a half-burnt manuscript recovered from the grate." Fenton frowned. "Vaguely. It was never solved, was it?" "Indeed, it withered in obscurity. But the parallels are striking. Burnt papers, a cipher of medieval origin, whispers of betrayal and misdirection. Our Mr. Latimer was not the first to chase such riddles, nor the first to die for it." Whimsy leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Do you know who was tangentially involved in that affair?" "A younger scholar assisting the investigation, who later resigned his lectureship under mysterious circumstances. None other than Professor Grantley." Fenton sat upright. "Grantley? Are you sure?" "Quite. I have a mind for names, Andrew. He was present when the Fenwick manuscript surfaced, though he claimed no responsibility when they vanished. And now here he is again, standing over the ashes of Latimer's work, trembling at their loss. One does not stumble twice into such peculiar fires without leaving one's coat singed." The inspector swore under his breath. "So Grantley has history with these ciphers. But that doesn't explain the compass." Whimsy smiled faintly. "Patience. Shadows of the past have long fingers. The compass is more than a navigator's toy. It is a symbol tied to the Fenwick documents. A compass rose marked the hidden diagram within, or so rumor claimed. Latimer must have rediscovered something, and someone sought to remind him, or silence him. They summoned the club members once more, though this time Whimsy directed his questions with surgical precision. To Mrs. Ashe had she known Grantley prior to her membership? She hesitated, then admitted they had corresponded years before on esoteric manuscripts. To Prentice, had any of the members met outside the club in private? The steward, after much hemming, confessed that Crisp and Grantley had attended several private gatherings with Latimer in the weeks before his death. Each answer drew threads tighter, weaving a web where once there had been only scattered lines. But it was a remark from Mrs. Ashe that sealed the matter. "Mr. Latimer had boasted," she said coolly, "that he would soon correct an injustice done to a colleague long ago. He never said whom he meant, but he delighted in such torments, dangling secrets just beyond reach." Whimsy caught the glint of truth. Latimer had unearthed something that pointed backward to the Fenwick case, to Grantley's involvement, perhaps even to Crisp's fear. The crime was not born of a single night's malice, but rooted in old betrayals. Later, alone in the study once more, Whimsy turned the compass in his hand, watching the needle tremble. "It betrays," Latimer had written. The compass itself was a false guide, planted to mislead, or perhaps to remind him of an earlier treachery. Latimer had realized too late that history was repeating itself, that the same circle of scholars who once danced around the Fenwick cipher now circled him. Fenton entered quietly, his boots damp from pacing the hall. "So it all goes back to an old case. The same men, the same cursed manuscripts." "Precisely," Whimsy said. "The locked room, the poisoned spoon, the burnt papers, clever tricks but mere surface. At the heart lies an older crime never solved, a betrayal never atoned. Until we bring that past into the open, the present will remain a shadow." The wind howled against the shutters, and somewhere in the house, a door creaked as though stirred by an unseen hand. The past was not finished with Gresham House, and the murderer, cloaked in its shadows, was not yet done with them either. The storm had not eased by morning. Grey light seeped through the curtains of Gresham House, flattening the rooms into shadows. Whimsy had scarcely slept, his mind paced even when his body was still. He had pieced together fragments of the past and present, but the maze still coiled with hidden passages. To smoke out the truth, he would need to abandon the neat paths of routine inquiry and try something more unorthodox. At breakfast, the suspects assembled with strained civility. Mrs. Ashe poured coffee as though she were mistress of the house. Grantley clutched his papers like a shield. Prentice lingered behind, watchful as a dog gauging its master's temper, and the maid flitted nervously between table and sideboard. Dr. Crisp, of course, was absent, still under guard at the yard. To the others it looked as though the matter were nearly resolved. To Whimsy, their composure was too neat, too ready. The true hand had not yet trembled. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said lightly, slipping into an empty chair. "A curious discovery has been made in the night." His voice carried just enough weight to freeze spoons halfway to mouths. "Inspector Fenton and I have reason to believe that Mr. Latimer left behind a final note, a message hidden in his cipher. And this time, I assure you, the fire did not consume it." All eyes fixed on him. Grantley's glasses slid down his nose as he leaned forward. Mrs. Ashe's hand stilled on the coffee pot. Prentice's jaw tightened. "Would you care to hear it?" Whimsy asked, drawing from his pocket a folded slip of paper. In truth, it bore nothing more than a few harmless lines from one of his own notebooks, disguised in the neat hand he had practiced in idle hours. Latimer, you see, was fond of riddles. This one says, "The thief I know, the betrayer I see. The compass points not north, but back to me." The silence that followed was heavy as lead. Whimsy let it stretch, watching their faces with idle serenity. He knew the words themselves meant little. The test lay in their reactions. Mrs. Ashe gave a faint laugh, brittle at the edges. A riddle indeed. Typical of Horace, even in death, to mock us with enigmas. But her eyes, sharp and glittering, had darted toward Grantley before she mastered them. Grantley's face blanched, his hand shook so violently he nearly spilled his tea. "That is absurd. A forgery, no doubt. Latimer would never leave such a childish rhyme." His denial was too quick, too vehement, the outrage rehearsed yet lacking conviction. Prentice, meanwhile, muttered something low and inaudible, his gaze fixed on the tablecloth, as if refusing to look at anyone at all. His silence was more telling than speech. Whimsy smiled pleasantly, slipping the false note back into his pocket. "Perhaps you are right, Professor. Yet a dying man's hand is unpredictable, don't you think? Strange how the mind latches onto symbols when words fail." Fenton, playing his part with grave solemnity, rose from his seat. "We shall investigate further. But I must warn you, if this note proves genuine, it will narrow our field considerably." Grantley shot to his feet, his composure fraying. "You cannot mean... You cannot suspect me?" "Latimer despised me." "Yes, but that is no crime. He thwarted my work, undermined me before the faculty, mocked me before my peers. But I did not kill him for it." His voice rang too loudly in the dining room, echoing against the paneling. "Curious," Whimsy murmured. "That you knew the note accused you, though I never named a soul." Grantley froze, realization dawning too late. His lips parted, but no answer came. He sat down heavily, perspiration standing on his brow. Mrs. Ashe watched him with a sharp, unreadable look, half pity, half triumph. Later, in the quiet of the study, Fenton exhaled in relief. "That was clever, Peter. A trick worthy of a stage conjurer. Did you see his face? If that didn't betray him, I don't know what will." Whimsy shook his head, thoughtful rather than satisfied. Grantley flinched, yes. But guilt is not the only thing that can unseat a man. Fear of discovery, fear of old sins resurrected, both can make the hand tremble. I suspect our professor knows more than he has admitted, but whether he wielded the poisoned spoon himself, that remains to be seen. He turned once more to the compass on the desk, setting it spinning gently under his finger. What intrigues me most is Mrs. Ashy. Did you notice her glance, swift as a needle's twitch, when the verse was read? She is far too clever to betray herself openly, yet she reacted. Her pride is armor, but even armor dents under the right blow. Fenton frowned. Then your note was aimed at both of them. Precisely. A compass has two poles, Andrew. Grantley broke under outrage, Ashy under silence. Between them lies the true alignment. One clings too hard to denial, the other conceals too carefully. And both, I think, are tied to that old Fenwick case, though neither has yet confessed it. As the storm raged on outside, Wimsey leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. His unconventional ploy had cracked the facade, but the maze still twisted onward. Somewhere between Grantley's panic and Ashy's poised deflection lay the truth. And until he found it, the shadows of Gresham House would not rest. Night fell heavy over Gresham House, the storm finally abating but leaving the air thick and oppressive, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the tension of the past days. Wimsey remained in Latimer's study, long after the others had retired, a lamp burning low at his side. The compass lay on the desk, the burnt scrap beside it, both silent companions to his restless thoughts. He had nudged two suspects to the edge of confession, but still the picture refused to resolve. And until it did, every object here was more than evidence. It was bait. The hush of the house deepened until only the ticking of the clock on the mantel remained. Wimsey leaned back, allowing his eyes to close for a moment, but his ears stayed pricked. Somewhere above, a floorboard creaked, deliberate but soft. His eyes opened at once. He remained still, listening, as the sound moved down the corridor, then silence. Whoever prowled did not wish to be heard. When he rose and opened the study door, the corridor was empty. He let the quiet swallow him, waited, then returned to the desk. For a moment he thought all was as before, but then his hand brushed wood where metal should have been. The compass was gone. His gaze swept the room. Sharp and cold. No broken latch, no forced entry, no window ajar. The thief had been deft. He bent low, examining the edge of the carpet. The faint disturbance of dust. Whoever had taken it had known precisely what they wanted, and how quickly to act. The compass, the symbol at the center of Latimer's last words, had vanished into the dark. Fenton burst in moments later, summoned by Wimsey's summons bell. What now? He demanded, eyes scanning the room. Our North Star has been plucked from the sky. Wimsey said softly. The compass is gone. The inspector swore, his face flushed with anger. Stolen. But how? Every door watched. Every member accounted for. Save for those who watch us in turn, Wimsey murmured. Do not forget, Andrew. The cleverest thief is not the one who slips unseen, but the one who convinces you he never moved at all. They roused the household. Grantley arrived pale and shaking, Ashy calm but wary, Prentice muttering under his breath. The maid clutched her apron, protesting she had not left her chamber. Questions flew, but answers dissolved in smoke. No one had seen or heard anything. Yet Wimsey, observing closely, saw the fine sheen of perspiration on Prentice's brow, the way Mrs. Ashy's hand tightened on the arm of her chair when the theft was mentioned, and the raw, unguarded anger that flickered across Grantley's face. Someone, Wimsey said pleasantly, believes that by removing a tool, they can erase the hand that wielded it. But evidence does not vanish so easily. A compass points not merely north, but back to the one who dared to hide it. The household dispersed again under watch, though unease lingered. Trust frayed. If one of them had slipped through the inspector's net tonight, then no watchman, no locked door, could be relied upon. Every ally might be an accomplice. Every silence might conceal a theft. Later, in private, Fenton paced furiously. "We were closing in, Peter! And now the most vital piece is gone. Without it, we've no proof of Latimer's final discovery." Wimsey regarded him calmly. "On the contrary, my dear Andrew. Its absence speaks as loudly as its presence. Only someone who feared what the compass revealed would dare remove it. That fear points us forward." "But it could be any of them," Fenton muttered. "Not any," Wimsey corrected. "Prentice sweats under questions, but his hands are clumsy. Grantley trembles at exposure, but he is too careless to risk a theft so neat. Mrs. Ashy, however, she wears control like a second skin. Her calm tonight was not relief but victory. She did not fear the theft would be discovered. She feared it would not succeed. Still, he did not move to accuse. Not yet. The stakes had risen too high, and the game had shifted into darker territory. The thief who prowled the corridors had shown both cunning and desperation. A crucial piece of the puzzle had been stripped from under their noses. And until it resurfaced, Wimsey could trust nothing. Not the evidence he held, not the words he heard, perhaps not even the allies at his side. He stood by the darkened window, staring into the reflection of his own face. "The compass has vanished, Andrew. But so too has the illusion of safety. Whoever killed Latimer is still among us, still weaving lies. And now, knowing the noose draws tight, they will strike again if they must. We must be ready." Outside, the clouds thinned to reveal a sliver of moon, cold and sharp as a blade. Inside Gresham House, the thief's hand had moved once more, erasing a clue and leaving only questions in its place. The maze twisted tighter, its shadows deeper, and Wimsey knew that the next step would not merely be pursuit of truth. It would be survival in a house where trust itself was a vanishing thing. The morning after the compass vanished dawned grey and restless, with clouds slanting rain across the courtyard in sharp, relentless streaks. Wimsey had barely closed his eyes when a sharp knock echoed through the hallway, abrupt enough to set his nerves on edge. Fenton met him at the door, his face pale. "It's the steward," he said. "Hey, he found something in the West Wing." Together they hurried, rain-damp carpets muffling their steps. They arrived at the corridor where Prentice had been stationed for the night. The steward was trembling violently, pointing toward a closed door at the far end. Wimsey's keen eyes caught the slight misalignment of the lock, a hint of recent tampering. Inside, the study was in disarray. Papers littered the floor. Shelves overturned, but the most shocking sight was the body sprawled across the carpet. Dr. Crisp had returned, or at least, a man dressed in his familiar scholarly attire, though now grotesquely still. A dagger, crude yet lethal, protruded from his chest, and a faint line of crimson marked the edge of the rug. Wimsey knelt slowly, his eyes scanning the scene without haste. He moved Andrew, but not alone. Observe the direction of the body, the disturbance in the carpet fibers. Someone struck swiftly, using the element of surprise. "And see here," he said, pointing to a small smear of ash on the dagger's handle. "The same burnt residue as from Latimer's notes. The murderer has carried it forward, a calling card or a warning." Fenton swore under his breath. 2 murders in a week. It's madness! And this proves our villain is cleverer than we anticipated. Clever, yes, but not infallible, Wimsey said, rising to his feet. He moved to the window, where the rain streaked the panes, blurring the courtyard below. "Notice the pattern, Andrew. Each act is designed to mislead. The compass disappears to distract us, Crisp's death is staged to panic us. And yet each leaves a trace, subtle though it may be. The murderer wants us to chase shadows, but the threads are there if we know how to read them. apprentice, still trembling, stammered. I didn't hear anyone, sir. The doors were all locked. I just found him. Of course, Whimsy said gently, patting the steward's shoulder. You are not at fault. But take note, whoever committed this had keys or knowledge of the lock mechanism and knew exactly when and where to strike. That narrows our suspect pool considerably. Mrs. Ashe entered quietly, her face pale but composed. She glanced at the body, then at Whimsy. This changes everything. Crisp, he was only tangentially involved, and now he's dead. Who could have known the timing so precisely? Someone very close, Whimsy replied, eyes narrowing. Close to Crisp, to Grantley, to the household. Someone who can move unseen and leave us scrambling in the dark. The rain eased into a soft drizzle, but the weight of the house seemed heavier, oppressive, as if the walls themselves bore witness to the unseen hand. Whimsy moved among the papers scattered on the floor, lifting fragments of Crisp's notes and examining each meticulously. In one corner, a tiny fragment of the compass, a shard of metal, inconspicuous, was lodged in the carpet pile. Whimsy picked it up, examining it under the lamp's weak glow. Observe, Andrew, he said, holding it between thumb and forefinger. They did not take the compass merely to hinder us. They sought to assert control, to send a message. We are always one step ahead, and by leaving this fragment, they are daring us to find it. A challenge masked as error. Fenton ran his hand through his hair, frustration and fear mingling. So what do we do now? The thief is also a killer, and he knows this house better than any of us. We've nothing, no compass, no clear suspect, and now a corpse. Whimsy smiled faintly, though the warmth never reached his eyes. We do not act blindly, Andrew. We anticipate. We read the signs. Whoever strikes next will expect hesitation. They will predict panic. And we, my dear fellow, shall give them neither. He turned toward the doorway, pausing to glance back at Crisp's body. All villain is audacious, yes, and deadly. But audacity always carries a telltale weight. Observe his methods, mark the objects he leaves behind. And consider not what he does, but why he does it. The compass, the dagger, the ash. They are not random. Each is a deliberate piece of communication. And communication, like a language, has rules. Once we understand them, we will see the direction in which he moves. Mrs. Ashe, her hands clasped tightly, stepped closer. Do you really think we can stop him before he strikes again? Whimsy's gaze met hers, calm yet unyielding. I do. But only if we do not trust appearances. The house is no longer safe for those who assume it is. Every shadow may conceal intent. Every smile may mask the next blow. And until we uncover the message he has left for us, the game is still very much in his hands. Outside, the clouds parted briefly, revealing the cold gleam of moonlight on the rain-soaked ground. Inside Gresham House, the murderer's shadow loomed longer, their audacity now confirmed by a second life extinguished. Whimsy stepped back from the scene, eyes alight with the same quiet intensity that had always seen through deception. The labyrinth had shifted. The stakes had risen, and the next move would not merely reveal the truth. It might decide who survived to see it. He set his jaw, already piecing together the patterns in his mind. Whoever had struck tonight had assumed they were untouchable. They were wrong. The house may be full of shadows, but shadows cannot hide from a mind that knows how to see in the dark. And Peter Whimsy, now more than ever, intended to illuminate every last corner. Whimsy spent the remainder of that night in the study, circling the scene of Dr. Crisp's death, like a predator pacing its territory. The storm had passed, leaving only the faint scent of damp stone and smoldering papers clinging to the air. He examined every angle of the room, crouched over fragments of ash, bent over the pattern of footprints, and studied the shard of metal from the compass with a scrutiny that made Fenton uneasy when the inspector peeked in. Each element seemed disconnected at first, a fragment here, a smear there, a trembling witness, but Whimsy knew better. There was a rhythm to the chaos, and he intended to find it. By morning the household had assembled in the main hall once more, faces drawn with anxiety. The second murder had tightened the noose of fear, and the air was taut with unspoken suspicion. Whimsy, however, appeared calm, almost serenely detached, as he walked among them. His gaze, always light but all-seeing, caught details others overlooked: the faint ash smudge on Prentice's cuff, the slight dust disturbance under Mrs. Ashley's chair, the deliberate stacking of books on Grantley's desk. "It is remarkable," Whimsy said softly, addressing no one in particular, "how often the truth hides in plain sight. One assumes that what is obvious is irrelevant, but it is not the grand gestures that betray a criminal. It is the small, persistent habits, the minor inconsistencies in behavior that accumulate unnoticed until they form a pattern." Fenton frowned. "You mean, all along, there have been signs we simply missed?" "Exactly," Whimsy replied, reaching for the shard of compass metal he had preserved. "Consider this. The compass itself was removed, but a fragment remained. Now, why leave a shard behind? It is too small to be accidental, too easily overlooked. Whoever left it intended for it to be found, or at least to hint at the method of theft. And yet, it was the same residue of ash found at both Latimer's and Crisp's desks. That, my dear Andrew, is the thread that binds the crimes." "Mrs. Ashley's brow furrowed. "You're saying the same person did both?" "Not necessarily alone," Whimsy said. "But certainly the same pattern governs both events. Observe the timing each act occurs after a particular trigger. The discovery of a cipher, the handling of the compass, even the reading of Latimer's notes aloud. The murderer anticipates reactions, exploits habits. Their crimes are choreographed, rehearsed in miniature." He walked slowly toward Grantley, who sat stiffly in his chair, eyes darting nervously. "Professor, do you remember your comment yesterday regarding the ash on the dagger? You said the residue was careless, unintentional. Yet notice how few handled the paper. Yet every scrap contains that very ash. Someone deliberately spread it, knew where it would be noticed. That is attention to detail, not error." Grantley's hand tightened around his papers, his knuckles blanching. I merely handled the fragments I found. I had nothing to do with Crisp's death." "Nothing? Perhaps," Whimsy allowed. "Or perhaps you handled them more than is convenient. But your discomfort is only part of the puzzle. Observe Mrs. Ashley. When the compass fragment was discovered, she reacted not with fear, but with an almost imperceptible twitch of her hand. A micro-expression telling to someone who knows what to see. Control, yes, but also recognition. Recognition of what? The maid entered then, bringing a tray of breakfast, and Whimsy's eyes caught another minor clue. Her steps faltered ever so slightly as she passed Mrs. Ashley, and she adjusted the tray with a tension that suggested hurried observation of someone's behavior, perhaps even of the detective himself. These small deviations, Whimsy continued, gesturing toward the household, seem trivial, but they are not. A fragment of compass, a smear of ash, a twitch of a hand, each tells a story. Only when they are connected do they form the pattern. He spread the shards, notes, and ashes across the table in front of Fenton, arranging them in a sequence according to time, location, and type. Observe the trajectory. Latimer's notes discovered. Compass removed, Crisp killed, evidence left subtly in place. The intervals are deliberate. The second act occurs only after the first has been registered, the first observed. The sequence is psychological fear, distraction, then execution. Fenton's eyes widened. So they were studying us as much as their victims. Precisely, Whimsy said. And this is where the key becomes visible. The pattern is not in the acts themselves, but in their timing and relation to observation. Someone is calculating reactions, predicting behaviors. And who else but a person intimate with both the victim's habits and the household's daily rhythm could do so? He paused, letting the words hang in the air, allowing the household to feel the weight of his observation. Then, softly, he added, "Notice the small, almost forgotten detail of Latimer's delight in verbal misdirection. A riddle, a cipher, a puzzle. These were all instruments, not just for amusement, but for control. Someone has mimicked that very approach in real life. That person is clever, patient, and familiar with human psychology." Whimsy walked to the window and stared out at the wet courtyard. And here is the final, overlooked clue, the handling of information itself. Who reacts too quickly? Who avoids observation? Who leaves evidence that is not evidence? We have already observed Grantley and Mrs. Ashe. One reacts with panic, the other with restraint. Both have access, both knowledge. And now, connecting past and present, we see it: the murderer is not an isolated actor. They are entwined with the events of the Fenwick cipher, aware of past failures, exploiting old fears. Mrs. Ashe shifted in her seat, her composure starting to falter, though she smiled faintly as if amused by his words. "You have an uncanny eye, Mr. Whimsy," she said. "And yet you still chase shadows, do you not? You do not know what lies behind the next corner." Whimsy turned, his gaze firm yet light, and picked up the shard of compass. "No, madam. But the pattern illuminates the corner before it is rounded. The trajectory, the residue, the micro-expressions, they point us to the next move. The house may be full of shadows, but shadows cannot escape the law of cause and effect. And the effect, I believe, will reveal our culprit." He arranged the fragments one last time, letting his mind trace the connections that had been invisible to all others. Ash on desks. Compass fragment left deliberately, micro-expressions, reactions timed to the reading of notes. The pattern emerged now as a coherent whole, a hidden map embedded in human behavior. "Andrew," he said finally, turning to Fenton, "we have walked blindly through a maze of chaos, misdirection, and murder. But now the walls show us their joints. The murderer has relied on assumptions, on the predictability of fear, on our tendency to separate events into isolated incidents. That error is ours to exploit. Observe, anticipate, and the next move will not surprise us. It will reveal itself, like the compass pointing true north after the storm." Fenton exhaled, a mixture of relief and renewed tension etched on his face. "Then we know where to look, Peter." "Not where," Whimsy corrected, "but how. And that, Andrew, is the difference between hunting blindly and capturing the unseen. The pattern has always been here, in plain sight, waiting for one with eyes to see it. And tonight, we shall watch, and the house will betray its secrets. Outside, the wind stirred the trees, and the last droplets of rain slid from the eaves. Within Gresham House, the chessboard of crime had shifted, and Peter Whimsy, with the pattern revealed, was ready to strike at the unseen hand that had orchestrated the chaos. The stage was set, and only the bold, or the foolish, would move next. The night deepened over Gresham House, shadows stretching long and indistinct across the walls. Whimsy sat quietly in the dimly lit study, tracing the trajectory of events in his mind, each action and reaction filed neatly, each seemingly trivial gesture catalogued for significance. The compass fragment, the ash residue, the subtle micro-expressions. They had formed a pattern. But the meaning behind the sequence remained elusive. What drove a person to commit 2 murders, to manipulate those around them with such precision? Money, jealousy, even professional rivalry, all seemed too shallow to justify the meticulous orchestration of terror. There had to be something more, something hidden beneath the layers of deceit. Fenton, exhausted but alert, joined him, shuffling papers and fragments across the desk. "Peter, we've narrowed the field. We can see the threads, but the heart of it, the reason for such cunning, remains concealed. It's not merely possession of Latimer's manuscripts or the compass, is it?" "Indeed, Andrew," Whimsy said softly, standing and moving toward the window. "If it were, the crimes would have been clumsy, desperate. Yet observe the artistry, the psychological manipulation. Each act was designed not merely to eliminate, but to control, to torment, to assert dominance over fear itself. This is not a crime born of profit, but of obsession." A soft knock at the door interrupted him, and Mrs. Ashe entered, her composure still intact, though her eyes betrayed subtle tension. "You wished to speak with me, Mr. Whimsy?" "Yes," he replied, gesturing for her to sit. "I have watched you closely, as I have all who dwell here. Your control, your poise, the careful way in which you responded to our tests. It is clear you understand more than you admit." Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she did not interrupt. "Consider," he continued, "the pattern of events, the placement of the compass, the use of the ash as a signature. Each step was intended to elicit reactions, to study the psychology of those around you. But why? Why orchestrate terror? Why murder Christ when he posed no direct threat? The answer lies in Latimer himself, and in the unresolved threads of the past." She shifted slightly, betraying the faintest unease. "Latimer discovered something you wished buried," Whimsy said, stepping closer. "A link to the Fenwick Safer case. An old betrayal that could expose your role, or the role of someone you protect. But this is more than self-preservation. It is the compulsion to dominate, to prove intellect and control above all else. You were willing to risk detection, to manipulate, to kill, because the mere idea of being outmaneuvered was intolerable." Her fingers trembled slightly as she clasped them together. You misunderstand. I did what I had to. The past, the injustice, it should never have been ignored. And yet," Whimsy said, voice steady, "it was ignored. Until Latimer's curiosity threatened to shine a light where you wished darkness to remain. Fear of exposure alone might explain a single act, but the elaboration, the care, the psychological games. This is obsession. A desire to bend others to your will, to command the reactions of every human within this house. It is not greed. It is the compulsion to control reality itself, to assert intellectual dominance. And when reality challenged you, you struck, not to survive, but to assert superiority." Her face paled, and she finally spoke, voice low and brittle. "You think I wanted to kill? I wanted only to stop him, to prevent him from revealing what could ruin more than me. It was about ensuring the truth was contained, yes, but not for petty gain. He delighted in tormenting, always testing, always observing. I could not allow it." Whimsy's eyes softened, though the sharpness of his intellect remained. "I understand your rationale, and in that you reveal the depth of your pathology. The human mind can justify almost any action, but obsession, the need to dominate others through fear, drives people to extremes. You manipulated perceptions, orchestrated events to test reactions, and even when confronted, you controlled the narrative of the household. Your intelligence, your skill, your charm, they were all instruments in the service of control." Mrs. Ashe's lips trembled, and she looked away. And Crisp and Latimer, they paid for it.
Yes,
Whimsy replied, voice calm but unyielding. And that is why you cannot escape responsibility. You acted not merely to conceal, but to command. The compass, the ash, the subtle manipulations, all serve as fingerprints of your obsession. And the pattern, which we now see, is proof that this was deliberate, premeditated, and driven by psychological compulsion rather than necessity alone. Fenton, who had remained silent, stepped forward, his face grim. You have confessed enough, madam. The evidence is overwhelming. The compass, the sequence of murders, the manipulation. It all points here, and your own admission confirms it. She slumped slightly in her chair, the calm veneer finally cracking. I did what I believed necessary. I could not let history repeat itself, not after the Fenwick case, not after Latimer's threats. I had to control it, control them, control everything. Whimsy nodded, observing her with a mixture of pity and detached curiosity. Control, yes. That is the motive that underlies all else. Money, rivalry, fear, they are secondary. The true motive is the compulsive need to assert dominance over events and over people, to orchestrate life as though it were a puzzle to be solved, a stage upon which others perform according to one's will, and when others fail to comply, or threaten to upend the carefully constructed order, action, even deadly action, becomes inevitable. The room was silent save for the faint ticking of the mantel clock. Mrs. Ashley's shoulders sagged, her strength spent from years of obsession and careful manipulation. Fenton took her by the arm, preparing to escort her, while Whimsy lingered, contemplative. This revelation, he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else, shows that our villain was never motivated by simple human desires. It was the mind itself, and the compulsion to dominate thought and fear in equal measure. And that, Andrew, explains why the pattern was so intricate, the crime so carefully choreographed, and the evidence so deliberate yet misleading. The motive, once hidden, now illuminates everything. As Mrs. Ashley was led away, her composure shattered yet intellect undimmed, Whimsy returned to the desk. The compass fragment lay there, innocuous now, but symbolic of the larger truth, that obsession, cunning, and the desire to control could turn a human being into an architect of terror. He held the shard between his fingers and reflected on how often the mind's drive to dominate, subtle and hidden, could reshape lives, even to the point of murder. Outside, the first pale light of dawn filtered through the windows. The storm had passed completely, leaving only the stillness of aftermath. In the quiet, Peter Whimsy allowed himself a measured smile. The hidden motive had been revealed, and the pattern clarified. The house had endured 2 murders, fear and deception, but now, with the psychology of the culprit laid bare, justice could proceed. And the twisted web of obsession that had threatened all within Gresham House would unravel under the relentless light of reason. He placed the compass fragment carefully in a drawer, symbolic and practical, and turned to Fenton. Andrew, we have seen the shadow behind the mask, the reason behind the action. What remains is merely to ensure the consequences follow. Neither leniency nor negligence can be afforded now. The mind that orchestrated terror has been exposed, and in that we find both clarity and resolution. Fenton nodded, grim but relieved. Then at last, Peter, we can close this chapter. Though one cannot help but wonder how many other obsessions lie dormant, waiting for their turn to strike. Whimsy smiled faintly, eyes lingering on the shards of compass and ash. Ah, Andrew, the world is full of such minds, but tonight, at least, ours is not among them. And in understanding, we have triumphed over the darkness that sought to command us all. The evening settled over Gresham House like a velvet curtain, soft yet weighted with expectation. Peter Wimsey moved through the corridors with quiet deliberation, the polished floors reflecting the lamplight as he made his way toward the main hall. Every room he passed, every shadow cast against the walls, he noted with the same meticulous care he had brought to the investigation from the first moment. Tonight, there would be no distraction, no improvisation. Every step, every glance, every word had been arranged to reveal what had remained hidden for too long. Fenton awaited him in the hall, pacing with nervous energy. "Peter," he said, voice low, "I confess I've never seen you so composed. After everything, the murders, the vanished compass, how can you be certain this will work?" Wimsey smiled faintly, the quiet precision of his mind radiating calm. "Because, Andrew, all the pieces are aligned. The pattern is known, the motive is clear, and the one who sought to manipulate the household has already shown the cracks in her armor. Now, it is only a matter of timing and subtle pressure." They arranged the gathering in the drawing room, a space selected for its openness and minimal concealment. Mrs. Ashe entered shortly thereafter, accompanied by the usual household staff, and Grantley. Her composure was, as always, immaculate, though Wimsey could see the slight tension at the corner of her eyes, the way her fingers twitched imperceptibly as she settled into a chair. "Ladies and gentlemen," Wimsey began, his voice even, almost conversational, "we have all endured a trying week. The disappearance of the compass, the deaths of Mr. Latimer and Dr. Crisp, and the fears that have gripped us, these have tested patience and courage alike. Yet, as is always the case, human actions leave traces, and even the most careful mind may betray itself." Mrs. Ashe tilted her head, curious but guarded. "And what exactly do you imply, Mr. Wimsey?" "Only this," he said, stepping closer, "that the pattern of events is no longer obscure. The sequence, the timing, the subtle manipulations, they all point to a single actor. And it is my contention, Andrew," he glanced briefly at Fenton, "that our perpetrator has been sitting here with us, confident in their control, believing that all had gone unnoticed." As his gaze swept the room, Wimsey fixed it upon Mrs. Ashe, who maintained her poise, though a faint tightening of her jaw betrayed recognition. "You have orchestrated terror, carefully, deliberately, but control, however clever, can falter under pressure. You have made mistakes, left evidence in plain sight, and allowed us to trace the pattern." Mrs. Ashe's voice, smooth but tinged with a hidden edge, replied, "And suppose I have, Mr. Wimsey, what proof do you have beyond conjecture and your charming deductions?" "Madam," Wimsey said, producing a small envelope from his coat pocket, "you will find that even conjecture, when guided by observation, becomes incontrovertible." He opened it and spread its contents across the table. The ash-stained notes, the compass fragment, photographs of footprint trails, and the collected sequence of incidents meticulously recorded over the week. Every act, every subtle trace, every micro-expression has been documented. The compass was removed, but a fragment remained. Ash from Latimer's notes appears at the scene of Crisp's death. Micro-expressions betrayed your awareness when the fragments were discovered. Each step was deliberate, yet you could not hide these signs from eyes trained to see. Her composure flickered, though she forced a slight smile. "And what do you intend to do with this, Mr. Wimsey?" "Merely to demonstrate the pattern," he replied calmly. "Observe, madam, the alignment of your actions with the timing of events. You anticipated reactions, yet you underestimated the persistence of observation. And now, with the net drawn taut, the final move remains your only choice." She studied him for a long moment, calculating, weighing her options. The room was still. Every observer held their breath. Whimsy's eyes never wavered, steady and assured, as if the truth itself lent him unshakable balance. Finally, she spoke, voice low and sharp. "You cannot possibly understand, you do not know what it was like. Being under the shadow of past failures, knowing that secrets, if revealed, could destroy lives. I acted out of necessity." Necessity, perhaps, Whimsy agreed, but the means, chosen. Manipulation, fear, murder, cannot be excused. And the truth, madam, is that necessity does not grant control over time, nor the past, nor the persistence of observation. What was hidden can only be concealed temporarily. And tonight, the evidence has cornered you. For the first time, the tension in her posture betrayed panic. She rose abruptly, a sudden gesture of defiance and desperation, and made for the door. Whimsy did not move, though Fenton reacted instantly, stepping forward. But the maneuver was anticipated. As she reached for the handle, a sharp, mechanical click echoed. The study door had been locked, the windows secured. Whimsy had orchestrated the trap carefully, ensuring escape routes were cut off without alarm. "Do not waste strength on resistance," Whimsy said softly. "There is no exit that will avoid consequence. You have orchestrated these horrors with intellect and precision, but intellect alone cannot outpace the law or the eye that observes consistently." She paused, trembling slightly, eyes darting around the room, calculating. "You think you've won," she said, voice strained. "But no one can understand the things I have seen, the pressure, the obsession that drove me." "I do understand," Whimsy replied evenly. "I understand that obsession can cloud judgment, can transform reason into tyranny, can elevate the compulsion to dominate above the value of human life. And that understanding is why I approached you carefully, observed your responses, and arranged the circumstances so that your own actions would reveal the truth. You have cornered yourself, madam, with nothing but the evidence of your own making." Her face fell, her defiance dissolving as the reality of exposure sank in. She sank back into the nearest chair, her hands clutching the arms. "Then it is over." "Yes," Whimsy said, gesturing slightly toward Fenton, who stepped forward to take control. "It is over, and the consequences will now follow, measured and just. Your intellect, your cunning, your obsession, all of it now lies exposed and accounted for." Mrs. Ashy's shoulders slumped fully, her calm facade gone, replaced by the exhaustion of a mind long driven by compulsion. Whimsy moved to the table, arranging the fragments of compass and ash neatly once more. "And so," he said softly, "the web of manipulation and terror is untangled. The pattern has been observed, the motive revealed, and the final act completed without further bloodshed. All that remains is for justice to proceed as it must." Fenton exhaled, relief tempered by lingering awe. "Peter, the meticulousness, the patience, you've done what seemed impossible. You've captured a mind that could have eluded any other investigator." Whimsy nodded, gaze drifting to the window where the first hints of dawn streaked the sky with pale light. "Patience, Andrew, and the understanding of human nature. One must read the small gestures, the inconsistencies, the obsessions that drive action. And when all threads converge, the truth emerges, silent, unyielding, and inescapable." The household, still in shock, remained seated as the officers prepared to take Mrs. Ashy into custody. The storm outside had passed entirely, leaving only a gentle breeze that whispered through the trees. Within the house, the echoes of past fear lingered faintly, but the pressure of suspense had lifted. Whimsy allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, tempered by reflection. The game had been intricate, the danger real, yet he had set the stage, read the patterns, anticipated the desperate moves. when brought the culprit to final accountability. The final confrontation had been executed with precision, the villain cornered by their own actions, and the house, at last, could breathe again, its shadows illuminated by the clarity of reason and observation. He looked once more at the table, at the compass fragment resting neatly beside the ash-stained notes. The pieces were complete. The labyrinth of deception had been navigated, the hidden motive exposed, and the final confrontation concluded without further loss. And in the quiet that followed, Peter Wimsey allowed himself the faintest smile, the knowledge that the mind, when carefully observed, could always be seen through. Even in the darkest of rooms, the house had begun to settle into a wary calm. Officers moved quietly through the corridors, processing evidence, cataloging fragments of ash, and securing the compass shard. The household, though relieved, remained tense, still absorbing the shock of the final confrontation. Peter Wimsey lingered in the drawing room, his eyes scanning the table where the collected artifacts lay meticulously arranged. He allowed himself a moment of stillness, reflecting on the resolution. Mrs. Ashley's motives had been revealed, the pattern discerned, and the culprits cornered. Yet there was something niggling at the edge of his consciousness, a detail that had refused to settle into place. Fenton approached, carrying a small bundle of papers from Crisp's desk, dampened slightly from the storm outside. "Peter, I thought we had everything," he said, his tone cautious, almost uncertain. "But I found these in a hidden drawer, a series of letters between Latimer and an unknown correspondent. They appear to be coded." Wimsey took them with careful fingers, his brow furrowing as he examined the neat, looping handwriting. "Most intriguing," he murmured. "Mrs. Ashley may have acted out of compulsion, obsession, and desire for control. But it is always prudent to consider whether she acted alone, or whether her actions were influenced, perhaps even orchestrated, by another mind. Let me see these letters more closely." They spread the correspondence across the table. Each letter, though brief, contained precise references to past events in the Fenwick cipher case, cryptic notes about timing, and unusual emphasis on seemingly minor objects: the compass, a particular chair, even the placement of books. One letter, in particular, struck Wimsey immediately. It referenced the sequence of the murders in language that, while disguised, outlined events that had already occurred. "Andrew," he said, voice low but tense, "this correspondence is posthumous in effect. Latimer's pen describes outcomes that align almost perfectly with what has transpired. The phrasing, the timing, the knowledge. It is as though someone guided the course of events from behind the scenes, using Mrs. Ashley as an instrument rather than the architect. Someone with intimate knowledge of the household, its routines, and the psychological tendencies of each individual." Fenton's eyes widened. "Are you suggesting she wasn't the true mastermind?" Wimsey nodded slowly. "It appears so. Her motive was real, genuine in its obsession with control, but the final orchestration, the timing, the calculated steps, the subtle clues left for us to observe, may not have been entirely hers. There is a hidden hand at play, one that manipulated both the sequence of terror and the perceptions of those involved, including ourselves." They pored over the letters, decoding the subtle ciphers within. One recurring motif emerged: an emphasis on ash, the compass, and timing that went beyond Mrs. Ashley's known habits. The correspondence suggested a presence who anticipated every move, who understood the psychological tendencies of both victims and investigator. Each phrase seemed to confirm that someone else had foreseen the chaos and subtly nudged it along. "Consider," Wimsey said, pointing to a marginal note in one letter, the mention of the one who observes without being seen. Mrs. Ashe has been the visible hand. The one who strikes, but the invisible hand may have remained entirely out of our field of vision. The true genius, or villain, has been orchestrating events from a position of concealment, ensuring that Mrs. Ashe's compulsions were directed toward outcomes beneficial to their ends. Fenton ran his hand through his hair. So all our deductions, our meticulous observations, Mrs. Ashe may have been a pawn. Precisely, Whimsy replied. A pawn with deadly instincts, yes, but a pawn nonetheless. And if the letters are genuine, they provide us with hints about the unseen manipulator's thinking, the way they anticipated reactions, and the methods by which they exerted influence without leaving themselves exposed. They continued their analysis late into the night. A subtle pattern emerged. Each act committed by Mrs. Ashe corresponded with a coded suggestion in Latimer's letters. The timing of Crisp's murder, the misplacement of evidence, the calculated spread of ash, it was all consistent with instructions embedded within the correspondence. Whimsy's mind raced, tracing each thread, comparing handwriting, phrasing, and psychological cues. There is only one way this could occur, Whimsy murmured, eyes narrowing as he connected the final dots. Someone who had unrestricted access to the letters, who could anticipate the responses of both Mrs. Ashe and the household, and who understood the manipulations of fear and control, orchestrated these events while remaining unseen. They were careful to allow the obvious villain to be apprehended, to conclude the matter in a way that misdirects attention. Fenton stared, realization dawning. But who? Who else would have that knowledge, that presence in the household? Whimsy leaned back, gaze distant yet sharp. Grantley. The name fell into the room with a quiet finality. Fenton blinked incredulous. Grantley. The quiet professor, ever helpful, ever composed. You think him? Yes, Whimsy said, his voice precise, almost clinical. Grantley has had access to Latimer's notes, he has observed behaviors, and he has intellect sufficient to manipulate both events and people subtly. The letters were never meant for Mrs. Ashe alone. She executed actions, yes, but under the influence of someone far more calculating, someone whose goal was to study, manipulate, and control outcomes while remaining hidden. They moved immediately, following Whimsy's lead to Grantley's study. The door, locked from the inside, yielded to the master key. Inside, they found him seated at his desk, papers scattered, a faint smile as though he had anticipated their arrival. He said smoothly, looking up. I wondered how long it would take before the brilliance of observation would catch up with the subtle hand guiding events. You have been perceptive, Mr. Whimsy, but even you have been constrained by the boundaries of your assumptions. You orchestrated the entire sequence, Whimsy stated calmly, allowing Mrs. Ashe to act, manipulating outcomes, predicting behaviors. Why? Grantley leaned back, fingers steepled. Why? Because it is the ultimate experiment. Psychology in motion, human behavior under pressure, observation of fear and obsession. I desired not simply the resolution of a crime, but the orchestration of events to test the human mind itself. Mrs. Ashe was a conduit, her compulsions predictable, exploitable, and through her, I could witness the reactions of all, including the detective who believes he sees through the veil. Fenton's hand went to his revolver, but Whimsy raised a finger. Observe, Andrew. Note the calm, the control. This is why he has remained invisible. Calculated patience and careful concealment. The very traits we missed until now. Grantley smiled faintly. You have uncovered Mrs. Ashe's motives, yes, but the true artistry lies in the unseen hand. Every move has been premeditated, every reaction accounted for. And now, you finally recognize the game as it was meant to be seen. Whimsy's eyes, unblinking and precise, met Grantley's. "Your game ends here. Observation and calculation cannot excuse murder. You have manipulated lives, orchestrated death, and tested the limits of human terror. The final act, though subtle, cannot escape consequence." Grantley's smile faded as Fenton moved forward. "You may have anticipated everyone's reactions, Professor," Whimsy continued, "but you did not account for the constancy of reason, nor the persistence of scrutiny. All the pieces are in place, and tonight, the final twist, the revelation of the hidden hand, has been illuminated." Grantley, for the first time, registered true alarm. Rising slowly from his chair, hands raised. The genius that had remained unseen, the orchestrator of chaos behind the apparent villainy, had been exposed. And Peter Whimsy, with composure and unerring intellect, had turned the final page of a case that had seemed resolved, revealing the depth of deception and securing the ultimate truth. In the silence that followed, the room seemed to hold its breath. The house, which had endured fear, obsession, and murder, had yielded its last secret, and in the quiet, Whimsy allowed himself the faintest smile, his genius tested, his insight confirmed, and the final revelation made plain. Even the most careful shadow cannot hide from the patient eye that observes all. The morning sunlight spilled weakly through the tall windows of Gresham House, casting long, thin shafts across the polished floors. Officers moved with deliberate efficiency, documenting evidence, securing the study, and preparing to escort Grantley out. The revelation of his orchestration, the hidden hand behind Mrs. Ashy's compulsions, had rippled through the household, leaving its residents a mixture of relief, disbelief, and lingering unease. Even Mrs. Ashy, now subdued and resigned, regarded the professor with a fragile recognition of the true scale of manipulation. Peter Whimsy stood in the center of the drawing room, hands clasped behind his back, eyes scanning the room as if it were a chessboard. He allowed the officers to perform their duties, conscious that the final clarity of the investigation depended not just on apprehension, but on the illumination of the sequence, the psychological rhythm, and the subtle threads that had eluded notice until now. "Observe," Whimsy said softly, speaking more to Fenton than anyone else. "That justice is often neither immediate nor absolute. Mrs. Ashy has been constrained by her own compulsions, and now Grantley's intellect, which remained concealed until last night, faces the consequences. Yet the sequence of events, the orchestration, the manipulation, the subtle misdirections, demonstrates how even the most carefully planned actions leave traces that are detectable to a mind trained in observation." Fenton, standing beside him, nodded. "It is remarkable, Peter, how you pieced together the hidden motives, the subtle cues, and even anticipated Grantley's unseen hand. To think that all this was orchestrated while we believed the case resolved." "Indeed," Whimsy replied, picking up the shard of compass, still preserved in its small envelope. Every fragment, every micro-expression, every residue of ash or subtle gesture was a part of a pattern. Small, nearly invisible, yet coherent when viewed in totality. This, Andrew, is why the unseen hand, which manipulated Mrs. Ashy and anticipated all reactions, was eventually revealed. He laid out the letters, the compass fragment, and the notes across the table. Take, for instance, the letters from Latimer. At first glance, they seemed innocuous. Mere ciphers, playful references, the ramblings of a scholarly mind. But encoded within were instructions, cues, and nudges that shaped Mrs. Ashy's actions without her full awareness. A subtle phrase, a slight emphasis, these were not idle details. They guided behavior, influenced timing, and ultimately ensured that each move could be anticipated, observed, and interpreted by the orchestrator. That is why Grantley's intervention remained invisible for so long. Mrs. Ashe, seated quietly now, whispered, almost to herself, "I was just the instrument. I did not know." "You were," Whimsy said gently, "but instruments may strike in error, and even the most skilled conductor leaves traces. Your actions were consistent with your own compulsions, predictable to one who knew human behavior as I do. Yet the careful orchestration of timing, subtle manipulations, and hidden guidance revealed the hidden mind. Every act, every hesitation, every twitch became evidence of the pattern that lay beyond your conscious awareness." Fenton gestured toward Grantley, still calm yet visibly rattled. "And so his punishment is ensured?" "Yes," Whimsy said, though his tone carried no triumph, only measured certainty. "The law will take its course. Yet observe the subtle lesson here. The most intricate mind may orchestrate events flawlessly in intent, but even the tiniest inconsistency, the smallest overlooked fragment, will ultimately betray it. Justice, though sometimes delayed, is guided by reason, patience, and relentless scrutiny." As officers prepared to escort Grantley, he glanced at Whimsy, his calm returning slightly. "You have been perceptive, detective. Even so, consider the notion that justice, as you define it, is not absolute. Circumstances, motives, and human error can leave the consequences incomplete." Whimsy regarded him steadily. "Perhaps, Professor. Yet the unseen threads are now visible, the manipulation revealed, and the victim's fates accounted for. Even if the intricacies of your design were intended to escape notice, they have been illuminated. The pattern, the motive, and the orchestration, every subtlety, is documented and understood, and for that, justice is served, if not perfect, then inevitable in its finality." He turned back to Fenton and Mrs. Ashe, who listened with quiet comprehension. "Let us also note the elements that were nearly missed, the clues that required careful scrutiny. The ash smears were not incidental. They marked the movements, the decisions, the focus of attention. The compass fragment was left deliberately, a red herring to misdirect attention while conveying information to the unseen hand. And the micro-expressions, the smallest human gestures, revealed the unspoken truths of intention, fear, and control. To observe these is to understand the human mind as much as the crimes themselves." Mrs. Ashe shivered slightly, as if both chastened and relieved. "I see now. The manipulation, the control, I was caught in a web I barely understood. And that," Whimsy said, "is the lesson of meticulous observation. Even those most skilled in deception will leave traces if one knows where to look. That is why the seemingly invisible hand was revealed, why the pattern emerged, and why the final resolution, justice, if imperfect, is ensured." Fenton exhaled, the tension that had gripped him for days finally loosening. "Peter, once again, you have demonstrated the power of methodical reasoning, patience, and insight. Even when the case seemed closed, the truth lay hidden in plain sight, and you saw it." Whimsy allowed himself a faint smile, the first genuine expression of calm in days. "Yes, Andrew. The visible villain was apprehended, the invisible manipulator revealed, and the threads of the pattern traced to their conclusion. Yet let us not forget, in all such cases, a mind trained in observation will find that justice is never absolute, that human complexity ensures that some shadows remain. The house is quieter now, the immediate danger ended, but the lessons remain: scrutiny, patience, and understanding are the instruments by which truth is revealed and deception exposed." Outside, the wind stirred faintly through the trees, carrying the first hints of spring. Within Gresham House, the atmosphere shifted from fear to reflective relief, the echoes of manipulation and obsession lingering faintly, but their source exposed. Peter Wimsey, calm and composed, surveyed the room one last time, noting each detail, every reaction, every subtle trace that had once concealed the truth. "Justice has been served, in its measure," he said softly, almost to himself, though the mind that sought to control all has left its lessons behind. The pattern is revealed, the motives understood, and the human hand, fallible yet illuminating, has been accounted for. And for that, the game at last is complete. Yet, even as he spoke, a small, almost imperceptible smile crossed Grantley's face as he was led away. It was subtle, fleeting, but enough to remind those who observed that even the most thorough investigation leaves room for the unexpected, that the mind is not so easily mastered, and that shadows, though revealed, may linger just beyond the edge of sight. Peter Wimsey noted it calmly. The way a general observes the retreat of a clever adversary, justice had been delivered, the pattern laid bare. But the mind that thrives on observation and calculation always leaves an echo, a final challenge to those who would claim absolute understanding. The sun had fully risen over the horizon, casting a pale gold light across the manicured grounds of Gresham House. The household, though relieved, remained subdued, its occupants moved by the lingering shadows of fear, manipulation, and revelation. Officers had escorted Grantley to the awaiting carriage. Mrs. Ashey had been secured under watch, and the household staff moved about quietly, attending to the tasks left in disarray by days of tension. Peter Wimsey stepped into the garden, breathing deeply, letting the fresh air clear the residual weight of observation and deduction. Fenton followed close behind, carrying the final bundle of correspondence and notes. "Peter," he said, voice soft, almost hesitant, "everything seems concluded. The perpetrators accounted for, the motives revealed, the pattern exposed. Is there anything more?" Wimsey's gaze drifted across the grounds, his mind still cataloguing subtle details. The sway of the trees, the path of light across the lawn, even the faint disarrangement of a flower bed near the side entrance. "Andrew," he said, tone quiet but deliberate, "we have revealed the visible villains, exposed the hidden hand, and traced the pattern to its conclusion. Yet one must always consider that human behavior leaves threads that may extend beyond immediate perception. Even when all appears resolved, a detail overlooked or a subtle clue may suggest that another layer remains." Fenton frowned. "Another layer? You think someone else is involved?" "Not necessarily in crime," Wimsey replied, "but in the shaping of events. Observe the correspondence from Latimer. There is a single postscript, nearly overlooked, marked with an unusual flourish. Observe and remember, the eye that sees is never idle. A curious phrase, repeated across multiple letters, yet its meaning remains partly cryptic. Latimer, I believe, anticipated that the observant mind might interpret more than the immediate threat. There may be messages embedded in the details, subtle nods toward future matters, or warnings left intentionally vague." Fenton's eyebrows rose. "So you think this is unfinished?" "Unfinished," Wimsey said slowly, "not in the sense of a crime unresolved, but in the sense that human behavior is a continuum. There are always shadows cast beyond what is seen, consequences and curiosities that stretch into the future. The compass, the ash, even the subtle gestures we catalogued, each leaves an imprint, a minor irregularity. Most are insignificant, yet one may conceal an entirely new puzzle." They wandered toward the fountain at the center of the garden, its water catching the sunlight in a ripple of reflections. Wimsey knelt briefly, inspecting a faint mark at the edge of the basin. A tiny scratch, nearly invisible, incongruous with the otherwise pristine stone. He traced it with a gloved finger, considering. "See this, Andrew? A small, almost trivial mark, It is not likely the work of Grantley, nor Mrs. Ashe, nor any ordinary accident. Yet it is the sort of detail that, if observed, might hint at intention or message. It may mean nothing, but it may also signal the beginning of another thread, another mind at work. Fenton bent closer. Another adversary. Perhaps, Wimsey said, straightening. Or perhaps it is a warning, a reminder, or a note of curiosity left by Latimer himself. The mind that is aware of observation, the mind that enjoys subtlety, often leaves breadcrumbs that are both guidance and puzzle. And we, as observers, are challenged to discern the pattern before it reveals itself fully. A cool breeze rustled the leaves above, carrying with it the scent of spring flowers. Wimsey inhaled deeply, allowing the momentary calm to settle around him. This house, he continued, has been the stage for compulsion, obsession, and manipulation. The visible villain, the hidden orchestrator. They have been revealed and will answer for their deeds. Yet the human element, the capacity for subtlety, for calculation, for deception, remains unpredictable. One must never assume the end is truly final. Fenton, sensing the weight of his words, nodded slowly. And you intend to follow up? Should another thread appear? I shall, Wimsey replied. A detective's vigilance is perpetual, for the mind capable of manipulation rarely rests. Every detail, no matter how minor, must be considered, catalogued and understood. Even now, as we depart from Gresham House, I am cataloguing, considering, and anticipating the questions that linger in the shadows. The case may appear concluded, yet the human mind is rarely so neat. Observation and reasoning are never exhausted, and the next puzzle may emerge when least expected. They began walking toward the carriage that would take them from the estate, each step measured, each glance deliberate. Wimsey paused briefly at the main door, turning back to glance over the house one last time. In a window on the upper floor, a faint shadow moved, not Mrs. Ashe, not Grantley, but a subtle figure almost indistinguishable from the darkness itself. The movement was slight, almost imperceptible, but it suggested awareness, presence, and perhaps curiosity. A lingering question, Wimsey murmured to Fenton, is never a failure of detection, but an acknowledgement of human complexity. One must leave room for subtlety, for the unseen, and for the mind that thrives beyond immediate perception. That is the essence of vigilance, and the reason a mystery never truly ends. Fenton's voice was quiet, almost reverent. And yet, Peter, we have seen more than anyone else could. Patterns, motives, even the hidden hand. Perhaps that is enough for now. For now, Wimsey agreed. But let us not forget each clue left unexamined, each gesture dismissed, may contain the seed of the next enigma. Gresham House has yielded its secrets. The crimes have been revealed, and justice administered. But the human mind leaves trails, subtle and enduring. That is the final lesson. The carriage rolled away, the garden and house shrinking behind them. Wimsey leaned back, hands folded, eyes scanning the passing landscape, ever alert to incongruities, patterns, and the possibility of hidden design. Somewhere in the subtle rhythms of the world, a question remained, a thread unseen, a mystery yet to emerge. And Peter Wimsey, calm, patient, and meticulous, knew that the game of observation, deduction, and revelation was never truly finished. As the wheels turned along the winding road, the faintest sense of anticipation lingered, not unease, not fear, but curiosity, the quiet pulse of intellect that signals the beginning of the next challenge. The mystery of Gresham House had concluded, but the lessons, the patterns and the faint, almost invisible threads remained, waiting for the keen eye that would, inevitably, notice. And somewhere just beyond perception, the faint echo of a shadow smiled.